Hello everyone and welcome back into another edition of the GSMC Dead Ball Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. My name is your host, Christopher Shepard. Thank you all for tuning in on yet another cold afternoon here in the tri-state area, but hopefully another midweek show that will brighten up your day, starting off by concluding our divisional round recaps with the Commanders, Lions, and Rams Eagles games over in the NFC. Going to be doing my midweek NBA power rankings, likely to see two teams from both conferences at the top of them again. Then I'll be talking about the signing of Roki Sasaki by the LA Dodgers, and another stone in their infinity gauntlet, and an already formidable rotation, and concluding with some Premier League transfer updates, specifically with some top 6 clubs. But before we get into any of that good stuff, I do want to remind you, as always, to like, follow, and subscribe to the show and the network if you haven't already and you want to keep up to date with all our new content, not just from my show, but from other shows around the network as well. But if you want to contribute and interact with the show a little bit more directly while we are live streaming, consider making yourselves available to the Super Chat, Super Things, and Super Stickers features here on YouTube. As always, a great way to leave your opinions and input on air. There always are a lot of different comments that we get throughout the show, and I genuinely appreciate all of them. It just makes the show that much better hearing your guys' feedback, input, opinions, what have you. But without further ado, let's jump right into our show, starting off with our first divisional round recap of the day. Let's talk a little bit about the surprise game of the weekend in the NFC divisional round. The Commanders taking the Lions on the road. A resounding victory for them, 45-31. And I feel like the story of this game came down to key members of the Washington Commanders team and organization. We're going to talk about all of them as much as we can, but also about the things that let the Lions down in this one, outside of, say, the turnovers, and now the subsequent fallout from their elimination in terms of their coordinators finding head coaching jobs, which we'll also address a little bit more tomorrow, considering how Aaron Glenn just got hired. But ultimately, an astonishing game from an astonishing team that's really catching fire at the right time. Without further ado, let's talk about this game. So like I said, I feel like the story of this game for the Commanders were the key players rather than anything, not necessarily on the field, but ultimately the overall outlook of this game. Because if these players, coaches, what have you, did not necessarily buy into the fact that they could beat the Detroit Lions, then I don't think any of what transpired on the field could have happened as effectively as it did. So shout out to all of these players in advance. Without further ado, let's talk about them. Starting off with, first and foremost, the most impressive rookie ever, Jaden Daniels. This kid is unflappable, and he proved so against a very depleted Lions defense that really could do nothing about him and this offense. 22 of 31, 299 yards, 2 touchdowns, and at least in this iteration of the NFL playoffs, he looks like the best quarterback left. He may not be the best quarterback in terms of experience left. You obviously have Patrick Mahomes and Josh Allen on the other side. And then Jalen Hurts is still in this bracket, and you have to play him on the road at Lincoln Financial Field no matter how hobbled he'll be. We'll talk about that in the Rams-Eagles segment. But ultimately, this has all been the work and poise of an incredible rookie quarterback who has the chance to become the first rookie to ever start a Super Bowl. And I think he can ultimately win it as well the way he's playing. No matter what the Lions threw at him, with what little left of their defense they had, whether it be the blitz, whether it be dropping back at the zone coverage, he just picked them apart. He had the right plays at the right time, which segues into my next pick for a key coach in this organization that believed in this young man and truly rejuvenated this offense, and that is Cliff Kingsbury. This was someone who was not much liked in the league after his tenure with Arizona, because there were moments when he was the Arizona Cardinals head coach where they looked like a fascinating offense and exciting to watch one at that, but then it petered out. down the line. They missed the playoffs, and ultimately the offense didn't look as good down the stretch. Now, as an offensive coordinator with a rookie quarterback, kudos to him for diagnosing the traits that truly stood out in Jayden Daniels and amplifying them. He's really making this offense heavily tailored to the strengths of what Jayden Daniels can do, and that's why it's paying off. Because I feel like if it were any other offensive setup, offensive game plan, potentially a quarterback like Jayden Daniels would have struggled, because he very much is kind of still this college-style quarterback where his dual threat ability shines, but not necessarily one who can push the tempo, say, or in a pro-style offense really operate in different ways. This is very much a college-style offense. There's no indictment of Jayden Daniels, because he does a lot of things well in the pros that not necessarily come to light in college, and he's done it in the postseason nevertheless. But it is an offense tailored to him, is what I'm trying to say. It is an offense that really buys into his strengths. So kudos to Cliff Kingsbury for diagnosing that as well, and for believing in Jayden Daniels in this postseason run, because believing in a rookie quarterback is sometimes hard in this situation. But Kingsbury believes in him, and it showed in how inflappable he was against Detroit. Then let's talk about this running game for the Commanders, because for large portions of the season, it has been one of the better rushing attacks in the league, but has floundered in recent weeks, especially when it comes to postseason success. But I gotta hand it to Brian Robinson. This guy, 15 carries, 77 yards, 2 TDs. His stats don't jump off the page, but ultimately, he kind of was the tone setter for how this offense went. He kind of, as the lead back, took the initiative to get them going on the ground, and as a result, it led to a little bit more consistency and balance in this offense as well. I was fully entrusted in Jayden Daniels' success as a passer as soon as I saw what Kingsbury was calling for him, but Brian Robinson was a nice kind of counterbalance to that. He was a nice kind of foil to Jayden Daniels. And so I feel like in this matchup against the Eagles, they may want to try run the football more to kind of slow down that defensive front. So the fact that Brian Robinson got going a little bit in this one really pays dividends. And then last but not least, in terms of key players who defined this game for Washington and defined this win for them, how about Mike Sainristil? And the Washington defense for that matter as well, but most importantly, Mike Sainristil. 2 interceptions for a young man who's coming in his rookie year and being asked to do countless things in the secondary. Wear so many different hats. A lot of injuries took place in that Washington secondary. The guys like St. Juste, Forbes, what have you. And Mike Sainristil had to line up in many different areas. He had to line up in the slot, outside, and yet he was the defensive MVP on the day for me for Washington. And this Washington defense forced all these turnovers, but Mike Sainristil did them when they mattered. He did them at the end of the second half, and he did it when he scored the pick 6. So ultimately, this game really came down to the poise of 2 rookies on both sides of the football, a running attack finally getting reestablished, and an offensive coordinator who truly bought into the narrative that this team could be successful, not just in the regular season, but in the postseason with a rookie QB if he just bought into his best traits. Now let's look at the Lions side of things, because granted, this was not a horrible game for Detroit by any means, but I do feel that the play where you could have seen it many different ways, whether it be an unnecessary roughness penalty that went uncalled or a pick 6 where Jared Goff went down. I feel like that's where this game completely turned on its head. Not just because of the impact it had on Goff and the impact it had on the 3 interceptions he threw, but also the decision he made to try and stop that. Because granted, yes, a pick 6 is bad, but you're still in this game. You're the Detroit Lions. Your team that feels like on any possession you can score points as much as your defense lets up. And your defense at that point in the game was kind of slow to that point. They weren't getting going. So for that to happen, and for Jared Goff to make the decision to try and make that block, I feel like really impacted the thought process of this Detroit Lions team. Because after that, it certainly looked like Jared Goff was kind of recovering potentially from this concussion, and he didn't look right this game, and it kind of led to some questionable play calls from offensive coordinator Ben Johnson in this game, where he decided on one of the biggest drives of the game to have Jameson Williams throw a pass. So it really led to weird decision making that did not do this Detroit Lions team any favors, and ultimately led to them being eliminated, which also now leads to their two coordinators being gone. The first coordinators in this postseason mix to get swiped up. And I feel like should the Lions have gone a little bit further in the postseason, you could have delayed that a little bit. Now this team is in full-on panic mode because you now only have Dan Campbell, who granted is a great coach, but really relied on both Johnson and Glenn to carry out the X's and O's, trying to find offensive and defensive coordinators now who can help continue the sustained success of this Lions team. And so I feel like the fallout from this game is more worrying for the Lions than the actual results of this one, because on the day, the Washington Commanders just had their key players step up. This wasn't necessarily about, the Lions completely underperforming, because they felt like they were right there, and a couple of calls didn't go their way, a couple of decisions didn't go their way, and ultimately this wasn't a terrible game from Detroit. They just turned the ball over, and you can't do that in the postseason. But it ultimately means even more now that their season is done than it did while it was still going on, because now you're sans two of your best coaches in your staff, and now you're going to be struggling to look for more. But granted, congratulations to the Washington Commanders going on to face their division rivals, the Philadelphia Eagles, at Lincoln Financial Field on Saturday. But ultimately, I feel kind of bad for Detroit because it seems as if their Super Bowl window is rapidly closing. But let me know what you think about this game to a greater extent. But coming up next, we transition to our final divisional round recap of the week, talking Rams-Eagles in that bizarre snow game. We'll be right back to talk about after this short break.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign.
I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows where 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits. I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Hello everyone and welcome back into the GSMC Dead Ball Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. Before we get into our second segment of today's show, I do want to remind you as always to consider making yourselves available to the Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features on YouTube to better contribute and interact with the show as we are live streaming. You can also do it through our website, GSMCpodcast.net. You can leave a tip, a donation, or any questions, comments, or concerns you have there as well. but I love hearing your input and feedback on the show throughout its duration. It is genuinely appreciated by not just me, but others around the network, and also just makes our shows that much better. Without further ado, let's jump into our second and final divisional round recap of the week, talking Rams-Eagles, that bizarre snow game that took place at Lincoln Financial Field. And this game, yes, it eventually became closer than a lot of people thought it would be after the events of the first half. But I do think that this game was very telling in how the Eagles want to approach the postseason and the rest of the postseason should they beat Washington come Saturday. Ultimately, it did display some concerns about how Philly looks going forward. More so on the offensive side of the ball, the defensive side of the ball, because granted, the defense did their job. They ultimately were the reason why Philly won this game in the end. But I do think that the issues we saw offensively could rear its ugly head against a Washington team that, yes, has struggled in areas where the Eagles have excelled all year, but have played this team before. This will be the third time they played them this season and have always played them close in this division, no matter how bad they've been throughout the years. And now that this is the best Washington Commanders team that Philly have faced, this could be a different outcome. But let's talk about the success they had in this game, because in this game, yes, everyone knew it was going to be ugly, and everyone knew it was going to be ugly around the third quarter when the snow started falling a little bit more heavily. But the difference between these two teams in both their games this season was Saquon Barkley. And that was as simple as that. Saquon in this game was the reason why this Rams defense, no matter how well it played, ultimately would come up short. Because Jalen Hurts, let's not forget, in this postseason hasn't surpassed 150 passing yards, let alone 200 in either game. And after that injury on that safety in the end zone in the third quarter, he really was hampered. So it was going to come down to Saquon Barkley. But Saquon Barkley is happier than ever to carry this team to victory. And that's what he did. And it's what he did in both games, and not just this one, but the other as well in the regular season. And so that's the reason why this Philadelphia Eagles team is still so dangerous. But I do want to talk about the underlying more ominous tones of this game, because Jalen Hurts' status for this weekend is definitely going to be a huge question. But ultimately, how will Saquon look after two games where he really expended a lot for this team, and also how both this offensive and defensive line will look after expending a lot of energy as well. And then also talk about the impact this could have on the Rams organizationally. A lot of questions about the futures of both Matthew Stafford and Cooper Kupp have arisen over the past couple of days, and so I would like to get into that. But let's start off with the winners of this game, the Eagles. They played a great game. Yes, it kind of got a little hairy at the end, but they stuck to their roots. They stuck to their run-heavy philosophy to the tune of Saquon having over 205 yards, 2 touchdowns, when I believe it's the 5th best postseason rushing yardage total in the history of the NFL. And on the defensive side of football, just let their line wreak havoc. Jalen Carter had a great game, perhaps the MVP of this game, especially for what he did on that last drive when he got a huge sack on a blown call at the line from the Rams and then forced Matthew Stafford's incompletion on 4th down to end it. But ultimately, that's the Eagles' MO. So you can't necessarily be mad about it if you're an armchair fan or casual fan of the NFL watching this game, because if you just take it at face value, it's boring, but it's Eagles football at its core, and it's what they might need to do to get to another Super Bowl. Granted, yes, Jalen Hurts in the Commanders game may be called upon to make big plays, and it's going to come down to how healthy he looks, because that knee injury obviously did hamper this team especially in the second half. He only threw 20 passes, and they were only for 128 yards. Also, you got to be thinking about this receiving core. One of the most talented receiving cores in the league, not necessarily getting the targets required to make a difference in games. And yes, Saquon's now the difference maker for you, but A.J. Brown and Devontae Smith crave targets, and they might need them to play catch-up to this prolific, high-power Commanders offense, who I feel like could cause problems for this Eagles defense and force them to play catch-up on the offensive side as well. So it's going to fall on Jalen Hurts and this receiving core to get going should the Commanders look as lethal as they did against Detroit. But ultimately, when you have a team built like this to suck the life out of opposing offenses and have a running back that can just take over games, suck the life out of them, and render it a moot point in terms of how much your offense can score because of how dominant he is, not just at bursting out the long runs, but controlling the clock as well, was an important factor in this one too. It's going to be difficult to beat this Philly team. And the Rams came damn close. But it did take, right, that Jalen Hurts injury to really hinder what this offense could do. And so, for the Commanders, yes, you might want to take advantage of that, but just know, you're also one of the worst run defenses in the league. And it hasn't been more apparent than in the postseason when you struggled with Bucky Irving and you struggled with Jahmyr Gibbs. So, you're going to want to take a lot more risks bringing pressure and blitzing Jalen Hurts than you might have done if he were fully healthy. But just remember that this team is not built right now on Jalen Hurts' success. It's built on Saquon Barkley's. And should you take those risks, you also have to think about the receiving core. Because yes, this pass attack is not as ambitious as it once might have been. But you still have to respect the fact that A.J. Brown and Devontae Smith are perhaps the best wide receiver tandem in the NFL. And there's a reason why. And so, I do feel like the Commanders might want to follow this Rams blueprint in how to generate pressure. Because I do feel like, unlike the Commanders, the Rams have more talent up front. But at the end of the day, I feel like the Commanders' best defense is their offense. And so, if you score a lot of points early and put that pressure on Philly, chances are you can start to get home. And that's what I think the Rams failed to do a little bit. The offense really failed to supplement this team early on, when the Eagles looked like they could have gotten, so to speak. I didn't know what I just said there. It just came to mind. Matthew Stafford didn't really get going, though, until the latter stages of this game. 26 of 44, 324 yards, 2 TDs looks good on paper, but not necessarily when you actually look at the full game. He did perform well in big moments, but because of his team falling behind early, not taking advantage of the situations their defense put them in, they were forced to play catch-up, and they were forced to, on the final drive, rush a couple things. And that's why, ultimately, Philly's talent overcame them. But their defense really, you could say, played better than the Eagles' defense at certain times. They had 7 sacks of Hurts, and granted, yes, most of them were because of his injury. Verse had an incredible game with 2 of them. But, again, you have to combine that with complementary football. Your defense can stop this offense a number of times, but unless your offense scores points, it's meaningless. And that's why Saquon and Hurts were able to break out those big three runs and truly demoralize this Rams effort to make this a close game early. Because looking at the outlook of this game, even when it was, say, 16-15 in the third quarter, felt like the Eagles just had control of this game, despite the fact that Hurts was injured. Just because you knew in the back of your mind they had Saquon Barkley in their back pocket. The Rams did a fantastic job to keep the score as close as it was. And there were a couple mistakes made by the Eagles late in this game as well. But because this offense struggled mightily in the first half, in fact, struggled without the snow more so than they did with the snow, I feel like that's where everything went awry. And now looking at the future of the Rams, Matthew Stafford and Cooper Kupp are definitely going to have a lot of questions asked about them. And I feel like they might not get answered as quickly as Rams fans might think. And I do believe that should Matthew Stafford return, he can still play at an elite level. He might not be, granted, the best QB in the NFC, but he's still one that can get the job done for you and get you to the postseason, get you in the tournament. And then Cooper Kupp obviously could be an interesting commodity on the trade market should he get there, but I feel like if you keep him, he perfectly complements what Puka Nakua's ascension to the number one role is about. And if you look at the depth of this Rams wide receiver room, yes, they have some nice pieces, but ultimately, can they supplement Puka like Cooper Kupp can? I don't necessarily think so. But I do think that this Rams team achieved a lot this year when they were down. This was a team that went to hell and back, and they were a fourth down away from potentially beating this vaunted Philadelphia Eagles team. But now we're left to think about what could have happened rather than what did happen if you're a Rams fan. And for the Eagles, if it's another win where they forced their identity onto another team and imposed their will from the jump. Let me know what you think about this game in the comments below. Let me know what you think about the championship matchup in the comments below, because coming up next, we're going to be transitioning over to the NBA and doing my midweek NBA power rankings. Should be a good one right after this short break.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free.
Hello everyone and welcome back into the GSMC Dead Ball Sports Podcast, brought to you as always for the GSMC Sports Network. And for our third segment of today's show, we're transitioning into the world of the NBA, doing our midweek NBA power rankings. Now granted, like I always say about the NBA, I don't watch it as religiously as some people who follow this network do, and I definitely don't follow it as religiously as my man Nelson holding it down in the GSMC Sports Podcast. But I do think that these power rankings are a good exercise to get me into the flow of the NBA and to get you as NBA fans who might be watching intrigued in this show as well. I always want to have as many segments from as many sports as possible to supplement the show as possible, in the NBA, as always, is ever popular. So without further ado, let's just jump right into it. If I mess up some facts about certain teams, I do apologize and bear with me, but let's just get right into it. Starting off at number 5, the newest entrant into my top 5 in the NBA power rankings, and they are the Memphis Grizzlies. This is a team I'm really excited about just because of their depth, both the inside and the outside. Obviously, they have do-everything guard Ja Morant. They've been incredible in their past couple of games. We talked about that game against the Timberwolves. It did come down to the wire, much like I thought it would. Their last game, 108-106 triumph there. They have stacked together a nice group of wins. Their only loss in the past 5 games was to a team at number 4 on this list. Spoiler alert if you know who they are. But I really think that this Memphis Grizzlies team is so well built. And I want to point out the fact that it's not just this backcourt that's electric. It's this front court as well, with players like Jaren Jackson, Brandon Clark, Jay Huff, and now Zach Edey coming into his own. And if those guys can really stretch the space, the floor as much as you want, and you have a guy like John Morant driving to the rim in fast break transition opportunities, then I do feel like this Memphis team is going to be tough to beat in this loaded Western Conference, and they're peaking at the right time. They have the best offense, I believe, in the NBA, and I think that they deserve to be in the top 5 of these rankings that will continue to grow rapidly as the season goes on. So I'm really excited about this new entry into my NBA power rankings because this team can click. And in the toughness of the Western Conference, you just have to feel like you can outscore anybody, and that's how I feel about this Memphis Grizzlies team, that they can. They can match up really well against every single team in that Western Conference, no matter how bad they are, no matter how excellent they are. But it's going to be tough down the stretch, so we'll see how it all pans out for them. But congratulations to the Memphis Grizzlies on breaking through into the top 5. Then let's talk about the team that was the only winner against the Grizzlies in their past 5 games, the Houston Rockets. I really like this team as well. They did have a puzzling loss to Detroit a couple nights ago, but that's just one blip on their radar. And I feel like this Rockets team is much better than that one game. Look at this roster and tell me that this doesn't feel like a team ready to make waves in the next couple of years in the NBA. They have Jalen Green, an elite young athlete, one of the best athletes in the NBA, loves driving to the rim, getting more confident in doing so, believing in veteran point guard Fred VanVleet to steady the ship as well. Then you have Alperen Sengun, one of the more underrated two-way players in the NBA. I love what he's able to do on the defensive side of the basketball as an undersized big man. I just really like the tenor of the squad. And yes, they're going to have a lot of questions asked about them if they don't win games like that Pistons game last night and they drop questionable games in the future, because granted, this still was a team that last year was at the bottom of this conference, and a lot of people are going to be questioning their ability to maintain this, not just this year, but in the years to come. But I believe they can, and they built very well in the draft. I really like this year's draft pick, Amen Thompson, another great two-way athlete, maybe going to become a better athlete than Jalen Green when all is said and done. But they're playing at a high level, and when you look at the Western Conference and you look at the top teams, and you look at the youth on all these teams and how the Rockets might match up against them, you might be saying, why not Houston? I feel like they match up well against the Grizzlies they beat a couple weeks ago. They match up well against the Thunder, who we'll talk about a little later on this list. And granted, they're not afraid of anyone anymore. They're now the ones making noise in the Western Conference. And so the fact that they're 1 year ahead of their rebuild and really surprising people could be a boon for their future. Because if no one believed in them this season, then look what they could be in 5 to 10 years. Yes, there are a lot of Western Conference teams who are going to be eking it out to make the championship. And so the Rockets are going to be one of those teams, and we're going to have to see how they sustain themselves. But they've given themselves a great foundation of a season this year to put them in that discussion. They deserve to be in the top 5 debates in terms of best teams in the NBA right now because of how well they built, because of their being one step ahead of the rebuild, because of the fact that all of these guys have improved, have matured this year, specifically Jalen Green, who's going to be the star of this team, the face of this franchise for many years to come. And as a result, they now have a lot of hope and optimism for not just their future, but for this year as well. So that's why they deservedly sit at number 4 in my rankings. Now let's talk about the most precarious placement on this list. At number 3, the Boston Celtics, a team that feels like they've been steadily in decline. Even though they haven't been in complete crisis mode, they still sit in second in the Eastern Conference standings. But they haven't had a 3-game win streak in many weeks. Both Jays have underperformed. Kristaps Porzingis hasn't really looked as impactful as people thought he would be after his return from injury. All the production from their bench has kind of dissipated. And now they're slowly falling out of favor in a lot of people's minds in the East. I still think this team at this best could just be the best team in the NBA. I'm not willing to fall off that wagon just yet, but we haven't seen as much as possible over the past couple of weeks. There were some questionable results where, for example, against the Hawks, I believe a couple days ago, they let a lead slip with 3 seconds left. They missed their free throws. And they had a questionable win against the Pelicans where they really let them into this game and should have won going away. And yes, they did have a nice little warm-up revenge game of sorts against Golden State where they blew them out by 40 on their home court. But until they get back to performing well on offense, shooting the 3 well like we know they can, and once the Jays get back into rhythm as well, that's when I start to feel this team will be as most dominant, but it hasn't been. And so we have to ask the questions about them, and they have to fall a little bit in my rankings because they're not playing as well as the top 2 teams here, and they haven't played well against inferior competition for many weeks now. So until they get back into that rhythm, until they figure out what this slump, what this blip, what this trend is like, then I can't really say they deserve to be in the upper echelons of these rankings. But they still sit at number 3 just because, A, the potential, and B, they haven't completely fallen off yet to the point where they're in complete crisis mode and we're saying break up the team. Because that's not the Boston I know. I feel like they still have the championship DNA. It is not showing up for as long as they need to sustain nice winning streaks, much like they did earlier in the year. So that's why they sit at number 3 in my power rankings for this week. Then at number 2, a lot of people will be skeptical about this or angered in some situations, but I have the Thunder still at 2, and this is no indictment of them. Yes, they got the revenge against the Cavs on their home court when Shea put up 40 on them. But I do feel like when you compare these 2 teams, I am a little bit more apprehensive about OKC's youth and how they're going to use their depth pieces using forward. Because these guys that are playing role-playing roles, the Isaiah Joes of the world, those kind of guys, the Hardensteins of the world, once the postseason comes around and you're going to have to make intelligent decisions, if you're a guy like Mark Daigneault, their head coach, about your roster, you're going to have to figure out how to maximize the depth you have. And right now, I feel like they're doing it at a very elite level, but I'm not necessarily certain because since this team is still relatively young, this would only be their 2nd consecutive year in the postseason, how they would really react to different changes, to mixing and matching, because right now, this team is firing on all cylinders, no matter what lineup they roll out there, with or without Chet, with or without Hardenstein, small ball rosters, what have you, nothing seems to rattle them. But I do think that the ultimate thing keeping them from the number 1 position for now is that question in my mind. How is their depth going to be tested, A, as the season goes on, and B, in the postseason when this loaded Western Conference really is going to look a lot more dangerous than ever. The Mavs are going to get healthier, and that would be one of the potential matchups they would have in the first round. LA is going to be a weird team to play if they get into the postseason. Minnesota, even though they're maddeningly inconsistent, they're a dangerous team. So the Thunder really have to start believing that all of these rotations they throw out there can bear fruit, not just in the regular season, but when it matters as well. And that's why they sit at number 2. And then finally, at number 1, we have the Cleveland Cavaliers. And yes, you have every right to criticize me if you think OKC should be higher, and I feel you. I'm right there with you. But the reason why the Cleveland Cavaliers are the number 1 spot for now, look at the path they have in the Eastern Conference. There are great teams, maybe even elite teams in the Eastern Conference, but they really haven't separated themselves. And Cleveland, in my mind, really has because of their improvement from last season when they were a playoff team. This is a team that last year lost to Boston in the second round, I believe, and now have improved from that point, have gotten better. Donovan Mitchell has become even more of a vocal leader. Darius Garland has really stepped up his game, especially from the perimeter. Evan Mobley has been the X factor in terms of his versatility on both ends of the floor. Jarrett Allen, always been one of the most underrated rim protectors in the NBA. Every single one of those players has improved, and it feels like the Eastern Conference as a collective whole has taken a step back. Boston doesn't look as good as it did last year. The Knicks, yes, are an elite team when their starting 5 is out there. When their depth is tested, they crumble. Milwaukee's a mess right now. Indiana's not the high-flying offense it once was, so why not Cleveland? Look at the path they have. The Eastern Conference is the weaker conference, and until the regular season is done, that will be the case. So Cleveland has more of an opportunity in the East to make more noise than the Thunder in the West, where every single game is going to be a test for you. But ultimately, I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of you say in the comments that the Thunder should be number 1, because I could see that being the case as well. But for now, the Cleveland Cavaliers rule the roost, even though the OKC Thunder got their revenge. But let me know what you think in the comments below, because coming next, we make another transition to another sport and talk about the final stone in the Infinity Gauntlet, potentially, for the LA Dodgers as they sign in another Japanese pitching sensation in Roki Sasaki. We'll be right back to talk about the details after this short break.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere.
Hello everyone and welcome back into the GSMC Dead Ball Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. And for our 4th segment, we're going to talk a little bit belatedly about one of the most groundbreaking signings in the MLB in this free agency cycle. The signing up by the Dodgers of young Japanese pitching sensation Roki Sasaki. And for a lot of MLB franchises, this is one of the most heartbreaking, as the Dodgers add another stone to their Infinity Gauntlet and to an already highly formidable pitching rotation. But, granted, considering the fact that Sasaki was not going to be an expensive purchase for any team, why not have the Dodgers sign them? He was there for the taking for any team, because of the fact that as an international amateur, he would not have cost as much. And the Dodgers took advantage of that. And the Dodgers have now created a rotation where almost every single pitcher, maybe outside of Gonsolin and May, can win a game for you. And so that's what's probably going to be frustrating for a lot of fans of other franchises who thought they were going to be in the mix for this guy. But congratulations to LA for taking advantage. Like I said, it's a rookie arrangement for one of the best pitching phenoms Japan might have ever produced. And for that deal, LA got a bargain. And now you have a rotation. that can put out Shohei Ohtani, Blake Snell, who you also just signed as well, Yoshinobu Yamamoto, Tyler Glasnow, Roki Sasaki, Clayton Kershaw, Gonsolin May, if they can get back into their 2020 form. And it becomes a truly formidable rotation that might be the best, in my opinion, in MLB history. But let's talk about the initial impact of this signing for the Dodgers and what it means for the future of their rotation, because it may well have been cemented for how cheap Sasaki came. Like I said, as an international amateur, and because he did not, I believe, play 6 years professionally, he was able to be signed by various MLB teams for a rookie deal. And yes, the signing bonuses and posting fees still need to be figured out, but it's the equivalent of only $6 million for a guy of Sasaki's caliber. And if scouts and pundits alike are right about this guy, that's going to be a coup for the LA Dodgers. There have been worries about how he's performed over recent years because he did see a little bit of velocity in some of his pitches lower, but ultimately in that league it was no sweat off his back because he still put up absurd numbers. And a lot of questions also were asked about where he could end up at the start of the season, because granted, as a quote-unquote rookie on a rookie contract, he could see himself in the minor leagues. And a lot of people feel that some of his pitches aren't as developed as others, and that could hold him back. But the pitches that are fully developed, his splitter, which is awarded an 80 grade, the best grade you could possibly get for Baseball America, could be enough to see him have a starting place in this rotation come April. So I do feel like this signing for the Dodgers could pay off in a major way no matter how you slice it. Whether you allow him time to grow and develop some of his pitches in the minor leagues or immediately start him out. But it's also going to be a question of how you view this rotation as well. Because while Sasaki's an incredible pitcher in his own right, he made us be the 4th or 5th best pitcher in this rotation. So you're going to have to figure out, right, how to schedule all these pitchers, who needs the rest, who doesn't, and if you want to give Sasaki the time of day and cementing him as, say, the ace of this rotation, much like other teams in the mix wanted him to be. And that's what makes this signing also so unusual, because Sasaki, like I said in recent segments about him, did want to be the number one guy for a lot of teams. He did want to be the guy that could go 7 or 8 innings. And for the Dodgers, I don't necessarily think that's going to happen right away. So I think that the Dodgers, for as good as they made themselves with all this offseason spending, have a weird conundrum. They just might be too good. And so Sasaki's positioning in all of this is going to be a question that arises countless times. So let's just talk about what he brings to the table, but also how the Dodgers could look from here on out. So let's talk about the concerns that may have arisen from MLB scouts and pundits about Sasaki. Because, like I said, from 2023 to 24, his velocity in the Japanese league, the major professional Japanese league, and average did lower. His strikeout rate dropped from an impressive 13.4 per 9 innings to 10.5. But the reason why no one's really panicking is because, listen to this. In a league with a 3.04 aggregate ERA, he's still over 111 innings in that same league had a 2.55 ERA. His worst is better than that Japanese league's best. And yes, the Japanese league is not as high caliber as the MLB. But the reason a lot of these Japanese pitchers succeed almost immediately as they come is because of the time they spend on the mound. And what I mean by that is they pitch well deeper into games than any modern MLB pitcher can. And that's what's really exciting about Roki Sasaki. Because for the future of the Dodgers, it presents to you someone in a very loaded rotation where, should that rotation, much like it has in the past, be befelled by injuries, can be an immediate stopgap for you. But it's also a question about how you develop him as well. Because if you see this decline and are worried by it, you don't necessarily want to test it and see it decline even more immediately. You might want to see him perform at a consistent level in a league equivalent to, say, or similar to the Japanese league, like the minor leagues, like AAA ball. And then see how his pitches develop, and subsequently, if the numbers go up again, before you supplant him in your rotation. And how that affects Sasaki is also going to be an important factor here. Because over there in Japan, Sasaki was the second coming of God to them, really. He was an incredible talent. He's still only 23 years old, and he feels himself like he can be the leader of an MLB rotation. But looking at this rotation and how it could balance out and who could potentially be in front of him, you have Shohei Ohtani, who, yes, because of his two-way abilities, may not be available as much as other pitchers. You now have Blake Snell. You now have Yamamoto as well, who could be making the case to be your ace as well, for how well he's pitched. You have Glasnow, who a lot of people have forgotten about because of his injury that kept him out for most of the season last year, but still an elite pitcher, former Cy Young winner. Clayton Kershaw, one of the greatest Dodgers pitchers of this era. And then guys in Gonsolin and May, who, yes, haven't performed consistently, but are still elite. How Sasaki fits into all of that's going to be bizarre. I think that ultimately the pathway forward, if you're the Dodgers, is through the minor leagues. But I feel like just because you feel like your rotation is formidable and you can send it out there and it's going to perform at a high level, but also the fact that you have to be aware of injuries, Sasaki could start right away. And then in terms of how you line it up, lefty-righty, which in my opinion is very important for some reason. I feel like if you put a guy like Snell, who you spend big money on as well, number one, then Yamamoto, who's a righty, then Shohei, who I believe is ambidextrous in terms of batting, but not necessarily pitching. And then a guy like Glasnow, who's a lefty. That's an interesting debate here, because Sasaki's another righty hand. Funnily enough, all of the Japanese guys on this team are righties when it comes to pitching. So say it's Snell, Ohtani, Glasnow, and Yamamoto. That's where the bottom of the rotation gets interesting. If I remember correctly, I haven't seen these two guys in a while. Both Gonsolin and May, and correct me if I'm wrong in the comments, Dodgers fans, because I haven't seen them in quite some time, like I said. Both of them are lefties. So, if you're looking at this rotation, Sasaki could slide and perfectly say behind a Glasnow or a Kershaw. But, granted, he would be the 5 to 6 guy on this rotation because of how insane it is. So, I feel like there are ways you can integrate Sasaki into this team immediately, but maybe not to the point where he becomes the superstar he himself wants. But I do think that if you look at the future of this team and see guys like Kershaw and see guys like Glasnow age out potentially, and maybe Gonsolin and May not work out as well as you initially thought they would. Then you start to see how a signing like Sasaki could bear fruit. Because you know that he's right there in terms of ability compared to, say, the lower end of this rotation. He might be better than Gonsolin and May already. And in terms of ability, in terms of timeline, in terms of injury status, he very well might be better than both Glasnow and Kershaw at this point. But it's going to be all about A, how the Dodgers invest in him, and B, how he invests in himself, not being the immediate superstar he could have been, say, with San Diego and Toronto, the two other finalists he had in mind. So overall, very intriguing signing for LA. I'm intrigued to see how this season initially goes. I'm intrigued to see where he starts off. I'm intrigued to see the trajectory of his first season as he adjusts to not necessarily being the biggest star on the team. But let me know what you think about the signing in the comments, because coming next, we're going to transition overseas, be talking some Premier League transfer updates for some of the top 6 teams and what they need to do for the rest of the window to ensure that they can improve. We'll be right back after this short break to talk about that to conclude today's show. Hello everyone and welcome back into our final segment of today's show here on the GSMC Dead Ball Sports Podcast. And for our final segment, we're going to be transitioning overseas, talking some Premier League transfer news, specifically with teams in the top 6, starting off with a team very much in crisis, one who Ruben Amorim, their new manager, branded as the worst United team in history, Manchester United. Let's talk about them in terms of how they could progress, but also how they could see a lot of guys who they could have been relying upon in their rebuild leave because of profit and sustainability rules within the Premier League. But ultimately, before we get into that, I do want to acknowledge a big part of their transfer philosophy. Manchester United have always spent big on all these signings with little to no effect. Zirkzee and Højlund looked like they were bad signings. Antony, who's finally looking like he'll potentially leave, was £100 million. And even though Harry Maguire has improved throughout his Manchester United career, he hasn't necessarily been a stalwart defender, let's say, for most of his Man United career. So all of these failed signings haven't bore fruit. And now Manchester United find themselves in a situation where they have very little margin for error in the transfer market, but also now have to fall under the profit and sustainability rules. And that could see guys like Rashford, who's already in talks to leave with Borussia Dortmund, and Antony as well looking to leave, and then a guy like Alejandro Garnacho, who many could see as potential building block for Amorim's rebuild, out as well. So I think the biggest question is not only the one I put on my screen as a left back really could help them in this moment, but also how they're going to deal with all the outgoings as much as who's incoming as well. But let us address that question on my screen. as the search for a left back is on for Man United. And they've had a lot of names floating around because of the fact that Ruben Amorim's system is so different than what many managers who have failed to succeed Sir Alex Ferguson have done. In this 3-4-2-1 formation, your left back, specifically your left wing back, needs to be able to push up the pitch very highly. And Luke Shaw and Terrell Malacia don't really fit that mold. Yes, Malacia can do it and did kind of do it in his tenure at Ajax, but both of them have been out with injuries for very much of their United careers and haven't really been effective. So, right now, you can see why the left back position is a concern for United, especially considering how Ruben Amorim wants to be able to implement his strategies with some sense of urgency and immediacy. So the names out there in their shortlist: Anthony Robinson, highly coveted by a lot of top 6 sides in the Premier League, Liverpool notwithstanding as well, a team we'll talk about here soon. And then Milos Kerkez, who I think is the better option, the Bournemouth left back, who's had an incredible season. But ultimately, I feel like if you're Man United, you're going to have to be cautious with how you spend, because seeing as to how your transfer strategies in the past have not worked, you want to be able to ensure that Amorim and Ineos are on the same page with this signing. So whether it be Robinson or Kerkez, you don't want to dish out too much cash, even though both Fulham and Bournemouth are looking for it in their own pushes up the table. But ultimately, it's going to come down to how United look throughout the rest of the transfer deadline and how many outgoings could be seen with this team. It's not just Marcus Rashford, it's not just Anthony, it's not just Garnacho, but it's some guys who failed them already, like Casemiro as well. Could Harry Maguire finally leave? Victor Lindelof's contract is expiring. So all of these outgoings, how they could affect Man United's transfer strategy, searching for that left back as well. But let's stop talking about them, because I think a lot of Man United fans are too much in pain to even think about transfer news. In addition to a team seemingly always in the mix in the transfer window, Manchester City. Now, Manchester City are a team that I feel like, since I wrote my notes, have been the busiest of the transfer window, and this question kind of makes me look a little bit silly, as most of their business is already done in terms of how people thought they would attack the window, their top 3 targets already being all but wrapped up. But I do think that it's now going to be about integrating into the squad. So let's talk about all 3 of those players. First and foremost, the man on my screen, Omar Marmoush, an incredible athlete coming from the Bundesliga, had a prolific start to his campaign with Eintracht Frankfurt this season, and seemingly fitting in very nicely in this Manchester City winger rotation. Seemingly could be seen as the new Riyad Mahrez in terms of his profile on the pitch and how he plays on the wing. But I do think that they needed to diversify that area of the pitch, specifically because of the stagnation of certain players like Doku and Savinho, who only recently has been getting into form and could really revitalize guys like Erling Haaland up front, and then Phil Foden, who needs to continue the pace he set for himself in 2025. And then both young defenders, Abdulkadir Kusanov, the first Uzbekistani player in the Premier League, and then Vitor Ais, the young Brazilian from Palmeiras, potentially not necessarily going to fix all of Man City's defensive woes, but certainly most of them. And I really like that Pep is looking to add some youthful exuberance to this team. I think that they're both very skilled defenders on the ball, really skilled in distribution as well, and I think they'll fit very well into the squad. But ultimately, this Man City squad also needs to trust the players that are already in place, because I do feel like they're more in the sum of the parts. They're more than what they're putting out on the field at the moment. And they are skilled enough not only just to integrate these 3 players into their squad, but to do well without them as well. But I do feel like that these 3 guys really can help them in their push for top 4 football. And I feel like this Man City team is not as bad as well as people think. It's just that a lot of injuries have befallen them, specifically that season-ending one to Rodri. They've had a couple injuries to Stones and Ruben Dias. But ultimately, when everyone gets healthy and Marmoush, Kusanov, and Reis get integrated into the squad, then you're looking at a side who many teams are not going to want to face. And this is the time of year when Manchester City really kick on. We're already starting to see it. Was Ipswich the nice reprise they needed to really bolster their push for not just top 4, but maybe a late title chase, even though they are well back in the picture? But that's all the news I wanted to really talk about with Man City, seeing as to how they already ruined my plans and signed all the players who we're going to talk about. Let's talk about the top team in the Premier League right now. A team that seemingly is marching its way to the title under Arne Slot and his slot machine, his possession-based squad. Let's talk about Liverpool. And let's specifically talk about what could happen after the season. Maybe some rumors arising in the January transfer window with this trio here on my screen of Mohamed Salah, Trent Alexander-Arnold, and Virgil van Dijk. All three of these guys up for extensions or to leave. A lot of offers have come in, whether it be for Salah from Saudi clubs, Real Madrid for both Van Dijk and Alexander-Arnold. But granted, I do feel like all three of these guys are in a good place. And even though they're the elder statesmen of a team that's trying to see more youth come through their ranks and really step up, I do think that all three of these players, maybe not Trent, seeing as to how they might want to go all in at him as they missed out on Alphonso Davies or Real Madrid, but I do think that both Salah and Van Dijk can certainly see themselves back here. But I do think that in terms of moves they can make should one of these guys leave, how about Jared Branthwaite? And this is more of a summer move because I think Liverpool will stand pat in the January transfer deadline unless offers for either of these three guys comes in. I feel like Jared Branthwaite could certainly bolster a defense that might need a new leader should Virgil van Dijk depart. And I do like the profile of Jared Branthwaite playing for an Everton side that is seemingly always sneakily good defensively. And I feel like his experience in a lower tier side will help prepare him for what Arne Slot wants in a more possession-based side in Liverpool who can control the game better than Everton ever could. So I do think that would be a nice signing. But the major issues here for Liverpool are with the futures of these three guys on my screen. But ultimately, looking at how Liverpool have set themselves up for the future, they're further along under Arne Slot than I think a lot of people thought, not necessarily to the point where they were out of the top 6, but definitely not title contenders and top of the table at this point in the season. But I do think that the future of these three guys will certainly determine how Liverpool looks moving forward. Because if you keep all three of them, it means that you are investing in these elder statesmen to still be the leaders of your team, but also setting up to where the torch can be passed to a guy like Branthwaite in the defense. Maybe to other various wingers who might just be on the team and who might come through signings. But I do think that out of all of these teams, Liverpool feel the most content with what they have and will just look to ensure that the future of this team can be pushed to the side for just a little bit longer as they focus on the three guys that have gotten to this point thus far. But ultimately, looking at all three of these teams, I feel like they're always going to be in and around the transfer news, so I had to talk about them in a major spotlight because of where they are. But that will just about do it for today's show. This has been the GSMC Dead Ball Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. I've been your host, Christopher Shepard. Thank you all for tuning in. We'll be back here tomorrow, as always, at 3:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Like, follow, and subscribe. Continue using the Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features to contribute and interact with the show a little bit more directly. We love hearing from you. But other than that, I am out for today. See y'all tomorrow.